Hey everyone, welcome back to the 443 Security Simplified. I'm your host, Mark the Liberty, and joining me today is...
Corey. Everything is awesome! Knockreiner. Although I think this podcast needs to make the dark parody of that Everything is Awesome song. I don't think I've seen a dark parody version. Exactly, there you go. We need to get our CGI skills and do the 443 Everything is Awful song.
Speaking of cynicism,
joining me is Corey Knockreiner. Can you remember the rest of the intro now that I've distracted you?
On today's episode, we are diving into the latest internet security report from the WatchGuard Threat Lab. And man, without further ado, let's go ahead and flip a page on in.
Flip a page?
Yeah.
That's pretty seamless, everyone. Did you see what Mark did? That he could be on broadcast TV. He didn't even waste a second. Today's episode...
Just go.
We'll do it live.
So this week, we have another fun episode for you where we are going to go through the just published Internet Security Report out of the WatchGuard Threat Lab. This report comes back from Q2 2023, recognizing we're about 3 months exactly from the end of that quarter now, but still very relevant information for some of the trends that we've been seeing targeting mid-market organizations and the rest of our customers over the course of that quarter. Before we jump into the actual stats, I have to imagine that most of our listeners have heard one of these spiels before at some point, but just in case we got some new listeners since the last quarter, Corey, do you want to very quickly explain why we do the Internet Security Report every quarter?
Yeah, it can be simple and short. It's because we want to try to figure out what the bad guys are doing. I mean, it's really that simple. Quantifiable information. You know, we all read articles, we all hear stories, but those are just anecdotal. This is all about kind of the quantifiable information we get from products and hoping that we can analyze that, cut it up in different ways, and honestly figure out what the bad guys are doing, if anything's changing, if new techniques are becoming more trendy, if old techniques are dropping off, or if the old techniques keep on going because bad guys like to repeat things. Either way, we want to know what they're doing so we can help you protect yourself. I will say this one, like Q1 of last year, we're really stirring up the pot in our data. The report comes from the same data from the same devices, which Mark will talk about with the Firebox feed, but we're changing the way we statistically analyze it. We're trying to get rid of outliers. So we did a little bit of that in our malware section last quarter, and this quarter we applied a lot of the kind of the removal of outliers to get more statistical confidence on the data we have. But the result is a change in a lot of numbers and inability for us to go back in history as much and compare because everything's kind of new. So it's exciting. You'll see things change, and over the next few quarters, we'll start to build a history with these new numbers.
Yeah, well said. So you mentioned the Firebox feed for those that haven't heard it before. The Firebox feed is just our name for our collection of threat intelligence that we get from WatchGuard customers that have opted into sharing it with us.
Granted, mostly the network stuff, right? We talk a lot about the Firebox feed, but there's some endpoint data in the report too.
Yep. From the Firebox perspective, though, if you manage your own device under the general settings, there's an option to send device feedback to WatchGuard. That checkbox sends some telemetry about services that you have enabled and services that you may be using that helps product management focus where their attention should go on the appliance. But it also allows that Firebox to send back a report for every threat that it blocks from one of our signature services while it's up and running. And that includes everything from the 3 anti-malware engines, Gateway Antivirus, the signature-based one, Intelligent AV, which uses machine learning. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm supposed to say AI now because that's what's important in the industry. AI to predict whether a file is bad or good. And then the cloud sandboxing service, APT blocker. Alongside those, we also get telemetry from the IPS engine. So looking for network attacks or attacks targeting network connected applications, as well as DNS Watch. So our DNS firewalling service that primarily protects against phishing, but as you'll see, can also catch malware, command and control, and botnet connections as well too. That's all the Firebox feed. So data strictly from the Fireboxes. Probably a year and a half, 2 years ago now, we also added data from our endpoints reporting in from AD360 and EPDR, where we can get this separate view of data of the threats that make it past or around the perimeter and onto the actual endpoint. And for those of you that have either heard us talk about past reports or have read past reports yourself, you'll know that that view of perimeter data versus endpoint threats can be quite a bit different. At the Firebox side, we see a lot of droppers and stagers and loaders, kind of that first step in the attack chain or malware delivery chain. Whereas at the endpoint, we can potentially see a little further down the line, and in some cases, see the end payload that the threat was trying to deliver, like ransomware or a crypto miner or remote access Trojan. So, with all that said, let's jump into some of the key takeaways from the malware section specifically of the Firebox feed. And first, some high-level stats that we try to share every quarter. One of the things we track is just the overall volume of malware impacting fireboxes that are deployed around the world. This quarter, we saw 1,177 detections per appliance over the course of the quarter. So we normalize the data based off the number of devices reporting in to give us a little bit better of a view on trends over time versus just looking at raw detections like we used to. And this quarter was actually slightly down overall from previous quarters. But when we look at the types of malware that we saw, there's actually some pretty drastic fluctuations. For example, threats detected by the signature-based gateway antivirus went up 41% to 516 per device, where threats detected by the last anti-malware engine in the chain, APT blocker, were down 52% over the quarter over quarter. And then in the middle of those, Intelligent AV, the AI engine, its volume of detections went up 113% quarter over quarter. So we're seeing a trend of both known malware, so signature-based detections going up, some of the more sophisticated detections kind of going down, but that can be explained a little bit by just how these engines sit in the line of when a file goes through which order. So IAV going up kind of explains where maybe we're catching more things with AI versus, and they don't even need to go to the sandbox-based detections overall. Corey?
By the way, I'm thinking live here, but since we keep on stirring up the way we report, one of the numbers you're going to hear, it's different when we talk about encrypted traffic, but because of APT going down, our 0-day number is an all-time low at an 11%. But this is hindsight 2020. It's already published, so we may have to adjust things. But I actually don't think that's right, because to me, 0-day malware, just so you know, we're not talking about 0-day exploits. We have to explain this every time. A lot of people think 0-day as a brand new vulnerability, which they should. That's what it is. But when we talk about 0-day malware, we mean malware that gets past basic signature protection, meaning GAV. But IAV, Intelligent AV, our AI, or machine learning really, AV is more sophisticated stuff that without signatures proactively catches stuff. So to me, the combination of APT and IAV is really 0-day malware, with GAV being the signature base. So it's not 0-day if a signature catches it, but if anything else catches it without a signature, including IAV, that probably is 0-day malware. But I believe we probably made the 11% number just based on APT blocker. Because notice 158 versus an overall of, 1,177. But if you add the 503 that IAV detected too, I actually think our 0-day number might be relatively normal compared to last quarter's.
Yeah, I'd have to check
Does
with
that make
our
sense?
analyst that wrote this section. I'm picking up what you're putting down. I don't know
that 0-day
actually.
number just represents APT in my opinion right now, which
So what
maybe
Corey's
is not the
saying,
right choice.
one of the numbers we track is we call it the 0-day malware number, which is the percentage of malware that gets past signature-based detections. And historically, we had based it off of the APT blocker engine and its relation to threats caught by it on appliances that are both licensed and configured to use it, versus threats that are caught by just gateway antivirus itself. So I'm not this is going to be a show notes. Let's go look it up later. But so the 0-day malware number is actually at its lowest that we've ever seen it in the report this quarter. And it was at 11%, like Corey said. That said, when we look at malware that arrives over an encrypted connection, that number goes up to 66%. And one of the stats we haven't gone over yet is that we also take a look at the percentage of malware that arrives over an encrypted connection. And now we have to do this calculation based off of a smaller pool of devices because not only I think like what 20% of administrators have enabled HTTPS inspection on their fireboxes.
It fluctuates, but that seems to be what our analyst Trevor sees most of the time.
Yep. Looking at that pool of devices, we found that 95.6% of all malware that we caught came in over an encrypted connection. Basically, what this means is if you're not doing HTTPS inspection at your perimeter, you're missing 95% of all the threats that are potentially going through it. That's a pretty substantial amount.
While we stir the pot on our own data, something I've been talking about in other reports is my belief is because only 20% are from this doing encrypted traffic, most of the general trends you see in this report is a combination of encrypted and non-encrypted. And I actually strongly believe that, for instance, our top 10 malware, that's both encrypted and non-encrypted, and the majority of those trends come from non-encrypted. I personally believe that probably doesn't tell you, the reader, the real story. You should probably pay more attention to the top 5 malware that we see over encrypted, because I think the real story for malware is happening in that encrypted data, but because so few people turn it on so far, you're not only missing the malware if you haven't turned it on, but our report only has a limited view from the few that do see that encrypted traffic. So long story short, as you read this, I would say pay more attention to any trends we talk about when we're talking about it in TLS traffic or encrypted traffic, because that's probably where the majority of the actual action is happening.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one for sure. Now, we won't go into all of the individual threats that we highlight in the report, but there's a couple that I did want to chat about on this podcast. First off, there were 2 Linux-based threats that we highlighted that were pretty interesting. One of them brute forces its way onto servers that expose SSH access to the internet. And then once on those systems, it attempts to steal other SSH keys or other credentials it can find and move laterally to form this botnet. I thought this was a good example of why even though SSH itself can be protected by authentication, and in some cases even multi-factor authentication, it's encrypted versus the super old telnet. But even with all those protections, it's not a service that you want to expose directly to the internet, especially not on a unhardened system. The other Linux-based threat that was interesting was a DDoS crypto miner that's at least related to another variant called Lucifer. This one's pretty cool, where it goes on, well, cool from a researcher perspective. One of the first things it does is it profiles the system and then tries to disable any resources that might eat up CPU cycles on that host, because its main goal is to spin up a Monero crypto miner, and it wants to make sure that it can have all the resources possible in order to mine the most cryptocurrency on that host. This is kind of interesting, though, because most crypto miners, they try and fly in under the radar and remain undetected as long as possible. But if you're going and killing processes of like Python scripts that are running or other services, I feel like that's immediately going to let the
not very stealthy.
Yeah.
On the flip side, for those that kind of rack it and forget it, this is a nasty one. Targeting Linux-based things means it's probably going after servers, which means this is probably most likely hitting something that has production processes that you want running on it. So having malware that literally kills the processes you want running on your servers is probably not great. But to your point, I absolutely, if you run at it, hopefully you're not racking and forgetting your important production servers. Hopefully you have some monitoring going on, and this one should probably light up a red light pretty darn quickly.
I imagine so. So moving on though, for time's sake,
Not
the
not
next
if
section.
Mark admins some. I'm sure someone's already taken over his honeypot and
Uh,
put my name. I'm kidding. I'm
man,
joking.
you say that, but the capture the flag infrastructure that we maintain year over year, that crap has been held together with like magic and bubblegum for like 5 years now. So,
To be fair, we only
but
have to pay attention to it for a month of the year, so it's easy to forget the
and
rest
I
of the time.
I justify my ignorance on it by the fact that it is literally a hacking competition, and so I just consider if you can own the whole thing, that's just
You
bonus points
won.
for you.
You won.
Yeah,
CTF.
exactly.
There you go. You get the prize.
Anyways, so moving on to the network attack section. So we track the volume of IPS detections quarter over quarter and year over year. And like Corey mentioned at the start of this episode, we applied some of our anomaly detection and outlier detection to our statistical analysis of the network attacks this quarter that we had previously added to the malware based threats last quarter. What that means is if you look at it just quarter over quarter, the volume of network attacks dropped significantly, around 80%. This last quarter, we saw around 93 detections per firebox, which is still that's basically one a day for each firebox out there of network attacks that the IPS engine blocked. We still see that if you remember from previous reports, our top network attack list is pretty top heavy, meaning the top 10 threats we see account for the overwhelming majority of just overall detections. Even with this new outlier protections or outlier detection and analysis, we're still finding it's very top heavy. So even when we pull out specific threats or specific destinations that have a high volume of detections, the overall spread of per signature, the number of detections we have overall was still similar ratios. But anyways, going into a few specific threats that we saw in there that stood out to me. One of them that we highlighted in the report was a SQL injection attack against an open source learning management system called A-Tutor, which has effectively been abandoned since like 2019. And the reason this is
And
worth
in
highlighting
where?
is Appendinware. There's a lot of open source software out there that becomes extremely popular, becomes widely downloaded, lots of stars on GitHub. And then because it's open source and the authors aren't really making any money, maybe they move on to something else. Maybe they get sick of dealing with all of the bugs that their users send in, and without getting paid for it, they just lose their drive to maintain it and it becomes abandonware. And if it's only one person or a small team managing it and they ditch managing it, doesn't stop people from downloading it. It just stops it from receiving security updates. Corey, anything you wanted to add on that one?
No, I think you explained it well.
Nodding
And
agreement.
what I think is surprising is there's probably a lot of Linux packages out there that are used regularly. Sometimes maybe framework packages you don't realize that are probably technically abandoned. There's a lot more abandonware out there that is regularly used, and I think people know, at least in the open source Linux world, I think.
It's this example isn't abandonware, but there's a extremely popular JavaScript library that just about every other library and most websites use. It's designed to backport new features to be compatible with older web browsers that don't necessarily support that specific version of JavaScript, so that you as a web developer can use a function name from a new version and know it will work on every web browser. It's maintained by a single author, and that author went to prison for about 11 months a few years ago. And so
11
during
months
that
of
time,
vulnerability window.
the package was totally unmaintained because they were the sole author, and it actually spawned this like discussion of like what do we do as an industry of software developers if like God forbid
They
that
go to
person were to like
jail.
pass away, like, or they go to prison for even longer, like how do
Plane
we
crash.
what's our designated survivor or rule of succession for taking over a package like that that's just massively used but owned by just a single dude? And it's an unsolved issue still in the open source space. Like some like package libraries, think like the Python package index or the Node package index for JavaScript based libraries. They do have mechanisms in place now to yank back ownership of some packages and hand them off to someone else, but it's very ad hoc and thankfully only used in emergency cases. But man, it is still a pretty gaping
Yeah.
hole in open source usage.
By the way, we like open source. That doesn't mean don't use it, but the price you pay with open source isn't just having to figure out and maintain something that may not be as well documented, and unless it's like an Apache product, may not have support. But it's this kind of thing. It's the calculation of that maintenance for it isn't just learning how to use a product that may not have been made for a dummy, more for an engineer, but it's all kinds of things like the maintainer disappearing and the expectation that if you want something new and the person maintaining it doesn't want to add it, you might have to code your own stuff, and maybe apply your own patches when they're in jail. So open source is good, but you got to make sure to calculate how much effort it is to support it when you use it.
Turns out enterprise support contracts are typically worth the expense.
Yeah, that's where Apache Foundation probably makes some money.
Yep. Speaking of Apache, one of the more widely exploited vulnerabilities we saw in this last quarter was actually exploits of 2 or 3 Apache Struts vulnerabilities from 2016 and 2017. I remember, maybe we didn't talk about it on the podcast, but I definitely wrote a post on Secplicity about these vulnerabilities when they came out, just because they were relatively trivial to exploit and widely used by a lot of applications on the internet. And they are still kicking around as a potential target to this day, now 6 and 7 years later. And if you take a look at the network attack section, you'll notice that's a pretty common trend. There's a lot of vulnerabilities that are, old, to put it mildly, that we're still seeing tools or attackers automatically try and exploit across the internet. One other detection I want to highlight from this quarter was an interesting one where it wasn't a specific vulnerability in an application like the ones we typically talk about. It was actually a signature designed to catch a specific type of attack against a web application or a web server. So specifically, it's designed to catch a slow Loris DDoS attack, and it showed up in our top 50 by volume for the first time in quite a while. If you're not familiar with a slow Loris DDoS attack, it's like the polar opposite of the extreme DDoS style attacks that you tend to see make the news these days, where someone will use like a reflective amplification attack to just overwhelm a target with data, typically abusing tools ranging from like DNS or memcached as a more extreme version where you can send a small request and get a giant response and throw it at some poor victim. A slow Loris DDoS attack, instead, it's a low and slow style denial of service attack that allows it to sometimes evade some of the DDoS protections you might have in place that's looking just at like traffic volume. So specifically, it's an application layer attack where it works by opening and maintaining as many simultaneous HTTP connections as possible on that destination. Basically, your server, every time it gets a new connection, it spins up a new thread to handle that request. The expectation is it will close that thread when that request closes, or if it sits there without any activity, it'll time out and close it then. Well, with a slow Loris attack, the attacker will first off open as many of these connections as it can, so it creates as many threads as possible, and then it waits and just sends very slow but periodic keep alive messages to keep those connections open. So just long enough that the web server doesn't time them out and close them, but slow enough that it actually doesn't generate a lot of traffic load for the attacker to be able to do that. And the end result is the server is not able to kill off those connections because they're still active, and it's not able to free up resources to ultimately handle new requests. And by the end of the day, or by the end of this attack, it's unable to handle legitimate requests coming in. So we saw a signature designed to catch this type of attack show up in the top 50, and we chatted about it a bit more in the report. Definitely recommend checking it out. So moving on, though, the last section in the Firebox feed.
Before we move on, this is like inside baseball. I'm probably breaking the fourth wall and talking about things we shouldn't in the making of this report. But to the I think something, maybe Mark, you can tell me, our IPS service works easily over HTTPS or non-HTTP, encryption and not encryption. If we can tell the difference, I think we need to expand our IPS section to include top 5 or top 10 encrypted too. Because I'm curious, in the same way that malware differs and when you're looking at encryption, and especially sophisticated malware differs, I think we agree that most of web traffic is encrypted now. I have a feeling a lot of this old stuff we're kind of seeing on the non-encrypted web just being spammed out by bots and pen testing tools might change quite a bit if we actually looked at encrypted connections. That, yeah, I mean, most of these are web application or web browser attacks, and 90% of the time both of those will be over HTTPS. So is it possible for us to differentiate HTTPS IPS in the data we have?
I am certain we can.
Might be something we should look at. So don't know when we can promise it, listener, but we'll try to add that to the report soon.
Coming soon to a report near you.
Meanwhile, Mark's idea, like, gosh darn it, now I have more work.
The report does not write itself yet, unfortunately. Actually, speaking of which, why don't we just have ChatGPT write the whole thing and free up all of our resources?
We ought to, man. Just, we have all the data. It speaks pretty well. Who cares about them hallucinations? They're fine.
Exactly. Anyways, now moving on. The last section in the Firebox feed is all about DNS analysis. So looking at domains and connections to malicious domains that were blocked by the DNS firewalling service DNSWatch. We break it down in the report into 3 main categories. So phishing domains, which, as you might guess, are websites and domains associated with phishing campaigns. There's malware domains, which are websites and destinations associated with either delivering or command and control for malware-based threats. And then there's compromised websites, which are previously or still legitimate websites where a threat actor has exploited a vulnerability in that site to host something malicious in an attempt to prey off of their otherwise good reputation to do their bad activities. So I won't go into everything, but there were a couple I wanted to highlight. So there were several domains that were a part of a SEO poisoning attack. Basically, the threat actors were abusing search engine optimization to try and get these destinations to rank highly for something, typically so they can then show up at the top of a list for something you might be searching for, let's say like power tools, and then rank them above the legitimate like DeWalt link. And instead you get a link for their phishing attack that might try and deliver malware if you're trying to download, like, I don't know, I was going to say drivers for your tools, but you're not plugging power tools into your laptop. So poor example in that case. But we saw a few different domains that were abusing that to then try and host phishing campaigns. Most of them tried to compromise Microsoft 365 credentials. So pretty much what we'd expect out of that style of activity. The other one that's interesting, so we had multiple websites that were WordPress blogs of varying sorts that had been compromised to either host malware or malware command and control connections, or even full-on phishing sites. One of them that stood out to me, it was a website. I'm picturing like a 60 or 70-year-old dude that just loves the LA Dodgers and set up this WordPress blog all about the Los Angeles Dodgers baseball team.
So like 90s style web design with lots of weird blinking under construction. If it's a 70 or 80 year old, it reminds me of
an old GeoCities website.
Yeah, there we go. GeoCities. That's exactly what I was saying. Anyways, keep going.
Yeah,
his Dodgers site.
So he's got a site with even up-to-date news on the LA Dodgers, but someone has compromised it to host a phishing attack against Twitter users, where if you go to a unlinked endpoint or URI on that website, you get what looks like a Twitter feed from 2014. In fact, it has a copyright from 2014. The first giveaway is that it still says Twitter and not X or whatever the heck that guy's named it these days. But on the page, it's even got a forum to log into your Twitter account, which seemingly would most likely give up your credentials for the threat actor to go take it over. So that was one example. There were a few others of them hosting just malware at different destinations, but I love this one just because the actual targeted website, the victim in this case, was like it. You just get this perfect
Just a
mental image
normal
of
Joe.
who's actually maintaining
Yeah.
it. Yeah,
But it
just
makes you think
these
of how
LA
easy
Dodgers.
sites can be compromised.
Yeah, and this isn't to throw stones at WordPress. Like WordPress is actually very secure on its own. It's that a lot of the plugins that you have in it have to have fairly elevated privileges within the WordPress operating
To
system
do
or
something.
ecosystem.
Yeah.
And if you don't keep those updated, it can easily open up things like remote code execution issues that can let someone gain access to the underlying web server in this case.
Just because we have some
Uh,
historical, I would say WordPress itself isn't perfect. They're good at keeping stuff secure. But if you're, I hate to say go to the cloud for everything, but if you're considering a WordPress anything, I found I preferred WordPress hosted, like the default, where your site is they host it in their cloud versus, I mean, if you're a control freak and want to install whatever darn plugin you want and have full admin control of your site, you can get on your own version of a WordPress that you spin up on a server. But the issue there is WordPress itself does have vulnerabilities, and then that leaves it on you for patching. And I found that if you do WordPress hosted, they limit the plugins, so maybe you don't have quite as much power. But because of that, one, when WordPress knows of something, it's fixed in the cloud immediately, even though you might have to wait a few weeks for the actual on-premise patch. And two, their whole point of limiting the plugins is actually to limit the risk of what can happen in their hosted cloud because they feel more liable for that. So if you're going to play with WordPress, besides like what Mark said, be careful more about the plugins and make sure to update those. Maybe consider hosted if you don't have a lot of time to maintain and secure things yourself.
Absolutely. So that was the end of the Firebox feed. Again, we go into much more detail in the report itself for specific types of threats and some additional stats.
I will say
But
for DNS analysis, by the way, last week we talked, one of your things was that SEO poisoning. We talked about Chat GPT or Bing, Bing AI malvertising. I hate to say it, but that could probably be blocked by DNS Watch. So the good news is if you go to Bing and get some bad ads served to you and your users click them, maybe we can help block those too. Just wanted to shout out last week's topic.
Great callback, Corey. That'll help our SEO if we link back to that episode as well, too. Anyways.
Because I have that malware planted, I'm trying to get a few more victims. So please go visit our Secplicity links.
That is exactly it. This is all just a ruse to maintain job security and sell more WatchGuard.
Oh, no, don't say that out. Someone just believed that. That's going to now be quoted out of context in Reddit, and there's going to be a whole new conspiracy about it.
There's no such thing as bad press, Corey.
That's true. I guess. Until you get indicted 100 times.
Yeah, no thanks. Moving on to the endpoint section, where we take a look at, instead of at the perimeter, down at the actual endpoint for threats that EPDR or 8360 blocked on devices. First and foremost, when it comes to just total malware volume at the endpoint, it was down about 8%. At the endpoint, so remember, you're typically behind multiple layers of protection, so it's rarer for a malware threat to make it to the endpoint. So instead of looking per endpoint, we look at per 1,000 endpoints for our stats. And we found around 981 attacks per 1,000 machines over the course of the quarter, which is still pretty dang close to about one per machine over the course of the quarter, which is, man, in my opinion, when you think about that, that's one too many.
I would say rare, by the way, that malware hits endpoints, rare with a new caveat. I guess it still is rare with host-based firewalls, but we definitely think it's rare in a traditional situation where you have a network firebox and most of your endpoints are at the office behind firebox. Because to your point, Mark, the malware is often caught by the network before it even gets to the point where something's on the endpoint. I do think you got, for this one, just be aware that probably 50% at least of these endpoints are just probably roaming around the world in home networks. I guess they still probably have some network thing there, but I don't trust other people's networks. So the reason you want that endpoint malware is for when it's not behind your lovely configured firebox. because then it may not be quite as rare for it to hit the endpoint.
Yep, agreed. So even though total volume was down, we actually saw an interesting shift in how widespread malware attacks were that reached the endpoint. So in the report, we break down the volume of detections we have based off of the number of machines that were affected. So we bucket them into, for example, threats that only impacted one single machine, or 2 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 50, 50 to 100, and 100 or more. And this quarter compared to last quarter, on the upper end of that, so threats that impacted, let's say, 100 or more machines, or 50 to 100, we saw that grow over the quarter. So the number of threats that impacted 10 to 50 machines was up 22%, and those that impacted 100 or more was up 21.5%. So even though malware volume's down, they are in general impacting more machines this quarter than the previous one. When we look at specific malware threats, the number one overall in volume, bless you, was one that you might expect from this last quarter. So if you remember, it was, I think, the very end of March, like the very last week of March, there was a pretty widely impacting software supply chain attack involving 3CX, the mobile, or not mobile phone, the VoIP
Voice over
technology.
IP. Yeah.
So it was at the very end of Q1, but it bled over into Q2. And at no surprise, the top malware detection we had for the course of Q2 was that Trojanized version of the 3CX application. Some of the other threats that we call out in the report, Glooptiba was a botnet that Google and law enforcement helped take down back in 2021, but actually made a resurgence in quarter two of this year. We saw it show up in the top 10 list. And then another one I wanted to highlight that we've talked about at the perimeter in previous reports in the Firebox feed, but I think it's the first time we chatted about it at the endpoint, was a downloader designed to go and grab the remote access, the free remote access tool, Amy Admin. So this is technically legitimate software. Think of it like a GoToMeeting or like GoToMyPC kind of software where it can allow someone to remote in and manage it. But this downloader, it's a malicious application designed to go and grab this legitimate software so a threat actor can then gain remote access to your computer. And we've seen this at the perimeter. We've seen downloaders that when we go look at the rest of the attack chain during our analysis, you found that it's downloading this. But this is one of the first times we've seen it, or at least talked about it at the endpoint too. When it comes to the top PUPs or potentially unwanted programs, the number one overall was a generic signature or detection family designed to catch cracked versions of Microsoft Office. That was number one by a pretty substantial margin as well, too. So unfortunately, folks that have EPDR or AD360 installed on the networks, some of their users are going and downloading cracked versions of Office. And while that, I mean, first off, it's illegal, so don't do it. While it may save you a little bit of money, these cracked versions of applications tend to come with malware or adware or unwanted guests along with them, too. I mean, this is entirely anecdotal. I remember from my childhood, every other CD key or CD cracker I would get off of LimeWire was just totally laced with malware. I feel very bad for my parents that I feel like my dad definitely got his money's worth with whatever anti-malware engine he installed on that computer back in the day.
Not that I would know from being in a person in college that was grayish. But I remember liking some of when finally you could have pirate forums, which would actually kind of have a crowd sourced grade or review of the different things to help weed out the actual plain key gen versus the one that's had all kinds of crap added to it. Crowdsourcing sometimes is useful because yes, you're right. I would say 80% of them came with something extra, and it was actually hard to find the group's original non-touched one.
Even the comments on a website that I've only heard of and never visited myself, called the Pirate Bay, did a great job of calling out
it must like Roman scurvy.
Exactly. Isn't the founder of that is he in hiding or is he in prison? I don't
I
remember.
don't know. So
Uh,
many people have taken it over the past decade to keep it going. I have no clue where it stands as far as its original founders.
yeah, but not that I've ever been there, but I've heard some friends of mine tell me that the comments on there at least were a good like smoke test of just how bad a potential file would be.
Yep.
But then you're potentially dealing with misinformation and people gaslighting you, trying to convince you that it's clean when in reality
Hey,
it's just a straight up remote
maybe
access
we
drone.
have a prediction, a new prediction. AI social engineering will be AI will be used to kind of automate comment generation to help social engineer people.
I guarantee that's already happening. I have a feeling that half the people on Reddit are just bots at this point.
I'm pretty sure that's the only quote unquote election fraud that was happening is fake comments on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter posts.
Yeah. Oh, hey, good news. We have another one of those coming up here soon. Hooray.
Our
Uh,
poor freaking listeners, man. We're such
anyways,
we enjoy our
not a political
cynicism.
podcast.
Hopefully you do too.
Everything is awful. So continuing with the pups, there were several in there that are just straight up adware downloaders. And then there was another one that showed up. I think it was number 10, where it was a signature or a detection family designed to catch effectively third party driver packs. Now think of like, you go to set up your new Dell computer, and instead of going to the actual Dell.com to download the drivers, you Google drivers for my Dell laptop, and you end up on one of these shady websites where they might deliver you the legitimate driver applications and they might deliver you them plus other crap. That sort of detection was showing up, I think, at number 10 in the top potentially unwanted programs for this quarter. One of the other things we track every quarter is the attack vectors. So, what was that initial like exploit or attack technique that they used in order to initiate that malware event on the endpoint? And if you remember from previous quarters, scripts have always been the number one for quarter over quarter for that actual vector for getting a threat on the endpoint. And it's typically around 90 to 95% of the threats we saw started with a script. In this quarter, that's actually down to about 74% of all malware originate with a script, which is still massive and substantial, but it's down from previous quarters. And taking up its place was a category that we just call Windows, which is around 17%. But this includes basically any application or program that's built into the Windows operating system. You can think of it like WMI, Windows Management Instructions, or PS Exec. So it's still a category of living off the land, but not scripts specifically. So I think if we were to bucket them together, quarter over quarter, it's still around 90 to 95% of threats are abusing living off the land techniques to kick off that malware infection on the host. But this time, the ratio of scripting like PowerShell versus some of these built-in programs like WMI or PS Exec changed a little bit, which was interesting to see. And then rounding out the endpoint section, we look at our favorite type of threat, and that is ransomware, because no one under the sun is sick of talking about hearing or being the victim of ransomware by now. But we still track some
Hopefully you're
interesting
just
things.
sick of hearing about it. It would suck if
I'm
you're sick
jaded.
of being the victim because that would mean you'd been the victim multiple times. Once is enough. Once is
I
too much.
I can guarantee we've got a substantial amount of partners or managed service providers here that have that one customer or that one class of customer that just will not listen to your advice and ends up being re-victimized. So I bet there's at least a few people here that are sick of dealing with ransomware victims. Put it that way.
Probably.
Anyways, some of the things we track are just overall ransomware volume, which was actually down. But when we look at the types of ransomware and specifically the categories, like those that use double extortion, that actually increased this quarter. We looked at a few specific new families that joined up as well too, and highlight how they've been some of their types of extortions and who they've been impacting. I think it's about a dozen or so notable ransomware breaches that we list out explicitly in the report. Definitely recommend checking it out, but we'll skip going into each of them individually just for time's sake. So I guess speaking of we always wrap up the reports with a not just scaring you with all of the data that we've seen from impacting customers, but we try and give you some, good defensive takeaways to take back to your organization, at least at a high level, to defend against the landscape. And Corey, I guess, do you want to start with the first one of our defensive highlights from this quarter? Since I'm pretty sure you wrote these.
Did I? Oh, I can't remember. I'm kidding. Well, I love the alliteration on abandonware. Me and Mark talked about this. If you're using a project that's not being maintained anymore, you better learn to code yourself if you really insist on using it. Every day that it's not being maintained is a chance that someone finds a vulnerability that's not being fixed. So you just have to really be careful with any software you're using, even if you love it, that's out of date. We're not trying to push people to force you to always upgrade to the next thing, because that's not always necessary.
Yes, it is.
Okay. I am a tech nerd, so I do get early adopter FOMO if I don't. But old stuff is fine too, as long as it's maintained. But just make sure it's not being abandoned and it's getting security patches.
The next one is all about hardening your Linux servers. So, like we mentioned earlier in the malware section, there were several threats that were impacting specifically Linux systems, and especially those that had services like SSH, remote access, exposed to the internet. The unfortunate reality is, you can get malware on any system, even Mac OS. And sometimes some of the non-Windows based systems are underprotected. And Linux can be one of those, either from the protection standpoint or the visibility standpoint. So make sure that you spend time hardening your Linux systems, removing unnecessary services, enabling strong authentication for those that you do still have in place, making sure you limit network access to them as well, and preferably stick it behind a VPN and don't expose it to the internet if you don't absolutely have to. Some of the similar techniques that you would apply to a Windows-based system or just any system in general absolutely do need to be applied to a Linux-based one, because they are under attack. Corey, you want to end up with the final takeaway?
Sure. And the last one is just keep looking at your defenses with a new perspective. I guess this goes along with us stirring the pot in our data. We're trying to look at our data in a new perspective to try and kind of find new trends in what threat actors are doing, or maybe things that were missed because they were hiding under the radar of big outliers. That was the noise to signal ratio. But in the same way, you should, you probably have some defenses you set up years ago that seem fine, but maybe you haven't taken a look at them for a long time. Maybe some of your policies are out of date. Maybe you've added some rules long ago to do something, and then that whole project is now gone, and you have these rules allowing things that don't even exist anymore. Who knows what it is? But just remember to take the time, even if you have defenses in place, to go back and look at it and consider what you really need, what you don't need, how you can downsize policies. Do you have administrative accounts, privileged service accounts that you set up for something that are no longer needed? Whatever that thing is, make sure to always go back and look at your defenses with the new perspective. Hopefully the new perspective you're getting from the data we share in a report like this Internet Security Report every quarter.
Yeah. So, man, that's a wrap for this one. Again, you can see the report at watchguard.com/security report if you want to download the entire 39-page document, or just the 1.5 page
that's
executive
kind of
summary.
Short one.
It is,
compared to some. We've had 50.
And good news, Q3 just ended and we grabbed our stats. So it's time to get cracking on the next one, I suppose.
Yay for us. More work.
More work. But hey.
And I just added things to add to the report. I do too.
Thank you, Mr. CSO. I appreciate the delegated tasks that you keep kicking down. Hey everyone, thanks again for listening. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. If you have any questions on today's topics or suggestions for future episode topics, you can reach out to us on Twitter or X. I'm never going to get that correct, ever. I'm at XORRO_. Core is at SecAdept. The both of us are at hashtag
XORRO_ is on X. Sorry.
Yes.
I talk over my own name, so it doesn't really matter anyways. Who needs to find at SecAdept?
The 443
443.
podcast. Thanks again for listening. You will hear from us next week.
Sorry about that. And the
Peace
week
out.
after. And the week after.